Personality. Somebody says, oh, he's got personality, she's got personality, personality, the song. What does that mean? What is personality and what does it have to do with psychology? What does it have to do with human behavior? Well, personality is kind of the typical modus operandi, or the typical way people behave. And what does it have to do with your behavior? Because everybody has a typical way that they behave, and that influences how they behave. For instance, if I were to say ENTJ, 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 some of you will know what I mean by that. Anybody who's taken the Myers-Briggs will know ENTJ. That means extrovert, intuitive, thinking, judging. That's a kind of personality test. Now, that's more of a pop personality test in terms of it's not something that's used really a lot in the scientific literature, but Myers-Briggs is something that's widely out there. It's something that a lot of people know about. But what is personality again? Personality is your typical way of behaving, sort of your typical way that you act. It's things like when you say, is somebody an introvert or an extrovert? Is somebody usually nervous or calm? Does somebody usually go with the flow, or do they have to have everything a certain way? Those are the kind of things you think about when you think about personality. What's a typical reaction? Why do we care? Well, in psychology, one of the goals is to explain and predict human behavior. Knowing someone's typical way of behaving is a good way to explain and predict their behavior. And what perspectives are there? I mean, how do we look at personality? We're going to look at sort of a couple different perspectives. We're going to look at psychodynamic, behaviorist and cognitive behaviorist, humanistic. We're going to look at a little bit about biological, trait theories, and personality assessments. So that's kind of where we're going with this. First of all, let's look at psychodynamic perspectives. Psychodynamic perspectives on personality. Somebody from a psychodynamic perspective, how would they describe somebody's typical way of behaving? Well, when you think of psychodynamics or you think of psychoanalytic history, Freud is the first person that comes to mind. Freud actually has theories that fit in this whole realm of personality. And in fact, we're going there. We're going to some of the most widely known theories out there. His first theory is personality in terms of structure. Freud theorized that personality had three big components: id, ego, and superego. Your id, he called the pleasure principle. In other words, what you want, your wishes, your desires. Right now, I want a chocolate chip cookie. My son made chocolate chip cookies yesterday or the day before. And I know there's still one left. So in my mind, I'm saying, ooh, I want a chocolate chip cookie. Okay? Thinking about it, I want it. That's my id saying, I want that. You could use food like that, like chocolate chip cookies. You could use a young man coming by and looking at a beautiful woman and saying, oh, attractive. Or a young woman looking at a beautiful man, looking at a handsome man. You could look at a kid wanting a toy. You could look at somebody wanting tickets to a game or a concert. It's basically the id is, what do I want? Your wants and desires. What would give you pleasure? What would make you feel good? That's the id. Okay? And that's the part you see up top. Then you have the ego, which is partially conscious and partially unconscious. The ego, or mostly conscious. The ego is that realistic? So, my scenario, I want a chocolate chip cookie. Well, I want the cookie. Then my ego says, well, could I have the cookie? Yeah, I could. I know where it is. Nobody else has spoken for it. I could literally there would be no problem logistically with me getting that cookie. So I could. Same thing. You see a guy seeing a good-looking woman. He wants to ask her out. Could he ask her out? Well, realistically, the thing is, does he have the ability to do it? Does he have the time to do it? Is there a reason for him not to? In other words, does he already know that she has a boyfriend? So you see where I'm going with that. The ego has to do with reality. So the id is the pleasure principle. The ego is the reality principle. Is it realistic? Is it logistically possible? So going back to my analogy of the cookie, yes, logistically possible. So id says, I want a cookie. The ego says, yeah, you could have your cookie. The superego is the part of should you. It's your conscience and telling you if it's something that's a good idea or not. My id could say, want a cookie. My ego could say, yeah, I could do it. Then my superego could come along and say, you've been eating too much ice cream lately. You shouldn't do that. Or, again, the thing of seeing somebody that you like. The superego could be the one that says, yeah, you could ask her out, but, she's got a boyfriend and that's not really a good thing to do. Or a kid wants a toy. Yeah, they could grab the toy, but it's somebody else's toy, and the superego would say, shouldn't do that. Okay? So the superego is the one that's your conscience saying, yes, no, is it a good idea or not? Likewise, I could say, I feel like a glass of water. And my id would say, oh my gosh, I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty. And ego would say, yeah, it would be very easy for you to get up and get a glass of water. My superego would say, that's a good thing to do. Your body needs water. Your body needs hydrated. Water's good for you. Yeah, go for it. So that's Freud's structure of personality. The id, ego, and superego. Freud also talked about defense mechanisms. Now, he has a bunch of them. I just wanted to bring up a couple of them here. There's transference, which he looked at in therapy in terms of somebody transferring their wishes or desires from themselves to the therapist, transferring stuff from themselves to the therapist, kind of like, oh, I like you and not this other person, kind of thing. Then there's displacement, and there's regression. Regression is when you're moving to an earlier time. Maybe a kid starts sucking their thumb when they haven't for a while. Maybe an adult decides they want to wrap up in a blanket and take a nap. And that's how they're dealing with something. Defense mechanisms is sort of when you have that desire and you can't accomplish that desire for some reason. Either logistically you can't, or it's something you shouldn't do. Defense mechanisms are a way to deal with that, to deal with not getting what you want. And that's what defense mechanisms are. There's a bunch of them. There's repression, which is, I don't want that. I don't want the cookie. So there's a lot of different ones, and you can look, they're explained. There's a whole list of them. Those are defense mechanisms. So Freud had structure of personality, defense mechanisms. He also has what he called psychosexual stages of development. This is where you hear terms like anal retentive, Oedipus complex, Electra complex. That's where those terms come from. How? Well, he decided that going through childhood, going through life, basically mostly childhood, the theories focused on childhood, people are focused on getting pleasure at different parts of their body. Babies go through what's called an oral stage. Everything goes in their mouth. They're focused on sucking from a bottle. So the oral stage. Then you have toddlers. And toddlers are focused on potty training. The anal stage. This is where that terms like you're being anal or anal retentive, that's where this comes from. because literally if you've heard the stories of your mom didn't potty train you right, that's where that comes from. Freud thinking that if it was too harsh or too lenient, then people would develop different types of personality traits. That's anal. So there's oral, anal. The next one is phallic, and that's preschool. So we have infant, toddler. Phallic is preschool, and that's when kids discover they have private parts, where you see, especially if you look at little boys, have figured out they have a private part, and sometimes it feels good to touch their privates. That's what Freud saw, and that's basically why he called it the phallic stage. Then you have latency, which is you don't really think about it much. And then you have genital, which is when you get to be teenagers, you're thinking about getting pleasure the adult way. Okay? So there's oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital are his psychosexual stages. So that's Freud. We also have some what we call neo-Freudians. And Alfred Adler was another psychodynamics theorist, and he's famous for the concept of an inferiority complex. He did some studies on birth order. He basically looked at we need to feel like we're successful, and if you don't, it could lead to what's called an inferiority complex. So another person that's considered psychodynamic is Erikson, and we've talked a lot about Erikson, and in lifespan development, Erikson is very well known. And his theory is more social. What social things do people have to do that help develop their personality over their lifespan? Then we have Jung. Jung was a contemporary of Freud's, and Jung is famous for the collective unconscious and archetypes. He took this idea of the unconscious a step further and said that everybody's born with a cultural unconscious. And that's where we get these things called archetypes, where you see from cultures all over the world, there's similar stories and similar people. There's the wise old woman, the magician, the old man, the warrior. There's a lot of symbolic characters that you see, and that he called them archetypes. The last lady, Horney, was one of a feminist psychodynamic researcher, and she did not like Freud, thought Freud's ideas were misogynistic, and basically instead of penis envy came up with womb envy, and she also did a lot of other things, but think of her as the feminist antithesis of Freud. So that's the other sort of neo-Freudian. In general, psychodynamic theories of personality. The good, the bad, the ugly. The good, they try to delve into why people behave the way they do. Why people have these typical modes of behavior, and not just describe them. They talk about why. That's the positive. Another positive is they do have some good therapy applications. The theories have translated into some good therapy techniques. Another positive is that they look at the role of the unconscious, because that's something that a lot of other theories don't do. So that's something different and unusual, and it could be considered a positive. The biggest negative, I think, for psychoanalytic theories, there's one big one and then one other kind of negative. The biggest negative is that they're very difficult, if not impossible, to test. You can't scientifically test, does somebody have an id? They're very theoretical, very not concrete and testable. So that's one of the big downsides. And other people would say one downside is that they can be kind of negative, because they're all on these desires and things like that. So that can be another downside. That's psychodynamic. Then we have behaviorist and cognitive behaviorist. Well, behaviorist perspectives of personality would go along the lines of all the other behaviorist stuff that's been talked about in psychology. It's that your personality is kind of formed through good old operant classical conditioning, through your environment. You learn, basically somebody is extroverted because they have done extroverted things in the past and they've been reinforced for that, so they do it. And our typical modes of behavior are because that's what we're typically reinforced for. That's behaviorist. Social cognitive adds a dimension of cognition on that. It adds vicarious reinforcement and punishment. It adds people's thinking through, do I think this is a good idea and why? Do I think I might get rewarded in the future? What do I hope to gain from this or not? It adds a further dimension of cognitively thinking it through. That's the big difference. There's a guy named Rotter who had a theory of locus of control. And he is known for, you have this internal versus external locus of control. Do I feel like I have control of my life? So I've got to do a video for a psych class. Do I feel like I have the ability to do that and I have everything I need to do that? Or do I feel like, oh my gosh, my internet's not working, I don't have the technology, and I feel like it's totally out of my control? If somebody's going to take a test, do they feel like, yeah, I can study for this, I got this, I have it's under my control whether I do well or not? Or are they, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to begin, I don't know what's going to be on the test? Is it just luck? Or is it something that's out of your control? That's the whole locus of control thing. Then we have a guy who did some research on basically how people decide whether to hold off on things. This guy did some research on a well-known what's called the marshmallow test. And what they did was they put big old marshmallows in front of kids and said, you can have it now if you want to, but if you wait, you can have two. And they wanted to find out if the kids would hold off. And they found out that kids who held off had a lot better prognosis, so to speak, than kids who didn't hold off. And that's the whole thing about Mischel and his sort of the personality traits. So that is the behaviorist and cognitive perspective, and that whole self-regulation and stuff is part of that cognitive piece. The next piece is what we call humanistic psychologists. Humanistic theories of personality. Humanistic theories are more, it does have that internal locus of control. It's people make their own personality characteristics. People control their own personality characteristics. It does look at why people do things, so in that sense it's similar to psychodynamic, but it doesn't look as much in the unconscious, and it sees the person as in control. We have one humanistic psychologist is Maslow, and Maslow is talked about in motivation also a lot. And he's the one that has the hierarchy, that pyramid of needs. And it's the physiological safety, belongingness, it's the pyramid of needs. And basically what he's saying is your personality develops as you get these needs fulfilled. And your goal is to fulfill these needs. And the top is self-actualization. Then you have Rogers, who he has this theory of unconditional positive regard, where personality is formed, and the best thing somebody can have is what's called unconditional positive regard. Have somebody who loves you no matter what. And part of personality is, do you have that or not? It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's just one thing he's really known for. So, pros and cons. Pros, some people would say that the fact that it's more positive than psychodynamic is a pro. A pro also is that it looks at a little bit why people behave the way they do. The big con is, just like psychodynamic, it's not very testable, not very scientifically testable, because it has a lot of more abstract concepts. So that is psychodynamic, behaviorist, humanistic. Then we have biology and trait, biological perspectives. You could say is personality biological? Was I born, I told you I'm an ENTJ. Was I born extroverted? Was I going to be extroverted no matter what? Well, people have looked at, and the answer is somewhat. Like everything else, personality is shaped both by your biology and your environment, by nature and nurture. There are physical differences in people that have different personalities. They've done some tests looking at brain differences. They've done tests looking at differences in saliva between extroverts and introverts. So there are physical differences of people with different traits. There are genetic components. If you look at people and how they behave similarly to their parents, you see that even with adoption studies. People having some personality traits from their biological parents, even though they weren't raised with them. So there is a genetic component to personality. However, just like a lot of other things, it's both. You're also influenced by your environment. So biology, there's no real part of the brain that says, oh my gosh, this is personality. But there are some slight differences depending on what you're looking at in terms of people that have different personality traits. So that's kind of a little bit about biological. The last thing is trait theories of personality. Trait theories of personality are theories in terms of they describe personality and categorize it, but they don't really try to explain it. So we have Cattell, who basically said there are certain factors, personality factors, and he broke those down. He used a technique called factor analysis to say what different things group together. Eysenck, same way. Factors. They all had different numbers of personality traits, okay? But they broke it down. One of the big theories of personality is called the 5-factor theory. Okay. This is, again, done through factor analysis. It's a statistical technique to see if you have a big survey, which questions link together. If you tend to score high on one question, you're going to score high on another one. Which questions link? It's a statistical way to do that. That's a 30-second thing on what factor analysis is. But the 5-factor model, you can think ocean. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness. Are you open to new things? Are you adventurous? Do you like trying new things, or are you set in your ways? Conscientiousness. Are you a person who, on the one extreme, has to have all the T's crossed and the I's dotted and everything in its place and everything done, and by golly, you go to your doctor's appointment every year on the dot, same day? That's one extreme, conscientious. The other extreme, low conscientiousness, would be, whatever, go with the flow, that kind of thing. That's another big kind of continuum that people can be on, from the very conscientious to not conscientious. That one has a link with physical health and job success. People that are highly conscientious tend to be physically healthier and tend to have more job success because they take care of business. Then you have extroversion, and that's what gives you energy. Does being around a lot of people give you energy, or does being alone give you energy? There are extremes. Again, there are the super extroverted, where they get pumped up by being in a crowd or in front of a crowd. And then they're the super introverted that don't want to be around anyone. A lot of people fall somewhere in between. Then there's agreeableness. That's just, are you nice? Are you pleasant and amenable and nice to people? That's agreeableness. And then there's neuroticism. Think of it as anxiety, worry. Are you a person who doesn't let things get to you, or you're a person who gets highly anxious about everything. That's neuroticism. The issue with the 5-factor theory is that everybody is on a continuum of those. If you plug it in and if you Google it, there are lots of personality inventories that will tell you where you are on those 5 factors. So, in the end, that's trait theories. That basically they aim to describe. And some positives. They do a good job of describing. They do a decent job of predicting. In other words, I'm extroverted. That does a decent job of predicting how I might behave in a certain situation. Now, are predictions always 100%? No. But they do a decent job of predicting how somebody's going to behave. So, they do a good job of describing. They do a good job of predicting. What they don't do is explain why somebody is the way they are. They might do a good job of describing me as an extrovert and predicting how I might behave in front of a bunch of people, but they don't talk about why I'm that way. Why I am a person that'll get up and talk in front of a class. So that's the downside. They don't do a good job of explaining why. Again, the good side is they do a good job of describing and a good job of predicting. Culture, there's a couple other things. One is culture and personality. Do people from different cultures have different personality traits? Sometimes. There are different cultural norms, which can cause people, again, part of personality is based on environment. And if people grow up in a certain environment, then certain things are expected. So cultural norms can affect your typical way of behaving. There's also one of the big areas of research in terms of culture and personality is this idea of collectivist versus individualistic culture. An individualistic culture, the U.S. is kind of the quintessential individualistic culture because it's like be all you can be, stick up for yourself, that kind of thing. That's individualistic. You're all in it for yourself. You're all you got to be in it for number one. You got to be the one to do it. Pick your stuff up by your bootstraps. Well, the good thing is it does create individual responsibility. The thing is, though, it can cause people not to rely on others when they need to. Collectivistic cultures a lot of times think of the group before the individual. And that's the difference. And there's differences in terms of social space. There's differences in terms of just typical ways of behaving. Things like saving face, where you want to help other people to look good in collectivist cultures because the importance of the group. So those are some cultural differences. The last thing I want to talk about is personality assessments. There are objective versus projective personality tests. Objective personality tests, the Myers-Briggs is one of them, and that's one of the big kind of pop personality tests. You can get, like I said, I'm an ENTJ. And feel free and share if any of you have taken that in terms of what you are on that personality test. There's a Myers-Briggs. There is the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This one is used in more scientific literature. It is used by some businesses. It has been used a lot and historically to screen people for psychological disorders because it has some scales that rate to see if you have or are in danger of having a psychological disorder. Those are some objective tests. You can find other just various things on the internet, some good, some bad, some ugly. I would encourage you to check it out and see what you think. Other than objective tests, which are mostly self-report measures, mostly do you agree or disagree with a statement and how much, and then it ranks you. There are two big time projective tests. In other words, you sit there and do something and a person analyzes your responses, but it's not straightforward. The first of these is the Rorschach. Ink blots. So if you look at a thing that just looks like a foot of ink, people will show that, a person will show that to you and say, what do you see? And you say, oh, I see a frog, I see a butterfly, I see somebody's blood spattered all over the place. I see a sunset. I see, basically you say what you see and they analyze that. The issue, it's good at really delving into the whys, like what's behind the way you behave. I mean, it gives you some insight and it allows a person to add things that you wouldn't expect. The disadvantage is it's hard to score. You have to be really trained to do it, and it's subjective in terms of there's still a little bit of that subjectivity of the scorer in terms of how they rate it. So that's the Rorschach, it's the ink blots. The other big one that's used is what's called the thematic apperception test, the TAT. And that is where you're shown a picture and you're asked to tell the story. What do you think is going on in this picture? And it may be a picture of a woman sitting at a desk staring at a window. And what do you think's happening here? Do you think she's waiting on her long-lost love? Do you think she's sitting there wondering when her kid's going to be home? Do you think she's daydreaming? Do you think she's planning her next class? What do you think is going on? That's the thematic apperception test. It has a number of picture cards, so to speak, and the person has to create a story. And it looks at things like achievement motivation. Does the person tell a lot of stories of a person who overcomes obstacles, for instance? So again, the advantage is a person can add stuff to it and you can really get an idea of what's going through their head. The disadvantage is it's really hard to score. That is personality. Everyone get on the internet, look up some personality tests, check them out, see what you think. Even share what you think is your typical way of behaving.